Gregor Gimmy, founder and CEO of 27pilots, specialist in venture client and corporate innovation with startups. A visionary at the intersection of open innovation and business impact, Gregor is recognized for helping leading companies solve critical challenges with agility through collaboration with highly specialized startups. At 27pilots, he guides global organizations such as Siemens, Bosch, and Holcim to develop and scale their own venture client programs, integrating disruptive solutions with real business impact. His approach enables companies to innovate at startup speed without compromising their processes or structures. Gregor Gimmy is an influential voice in the innovation ecosystem, frequently invited to speak internationally, where he shares insights on how startups can drive digital transformation, operational efficiency, and sustainable growth for large companies.
In Mobile World Congress Day 3. So thank you for saying yes and coming to hang out.
Thank you very much for this wonderful welcome.
To sunny Barcelona.
Yeah, unique welcome. I've been coming to Barcelona for many years, but this is certainly one of the most memorable pickups. So
that is cool. All right, we'll start with Ad Energy. And for the people out there that don't know anything about you, how did you start in this industry and how did you end up being in Barcelona here at Mobile World Congress?
Okay. Well, I ended up in the startup industry when way back in the 90s, I had an idea to move to Silicon Valley.
Okay. And why was that idea? Was it like, I'm going to go pursue the American dream? Like I personally did that. I'm Brazilian. I went to Canada instead.
Well, actually, I was living here in Barcelona. My background, I'm German. I came to Barcelona when I was a small kid, and I went to study to Germany, joined a strategy consulting firm, and then came back to Barcelona. And while I was doing the strategy consulting work, I fell in love with the world of design. Okay. And as you know, Barcelona is a design city with great designers. So I really got into this world of design and thought, well, if I combine design and strategy consulting, I'm just a better innovation consultant. So where is the best design firm on earth for which I could work in order to go beyond design and help companies innovate? And that was a company in Silicon Valley called IDEO.
Okay.
IDEO, and so.
And what did IDEO do?
IDEO is if you heard about the term design thinking.
Yeah, of course.
So that's where design thinking emerged in Silicon Valley. So IDEO is a company in Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto, that helped really local big corporates, but also startups, to really develop great products. They do the engineering part, the design part, the human factors part. One of their early clients was Steve Jobs back then. They designed the first Apple mouse. That's one of the historic designs they did back in the early 80s or late 70s.
I did not know that.
So yeah, was kind of like one of the hidden champions in Silicon Valley, where many startups and VCs would actually go there and say, look, I have an invention. I don't know, there's a chip that can smell, correct? I invented this. And I would like to make a business out of that. I need to make a product out of that. So if you want to turn this into a product, you need an engineer, you need designers, you need thinkers who can think. What's the use cases, what's the market? And that's really one of the strengths of IDEO. So moving to IDEO was really my really step into this world of startups, Silicon Valley, because that's at the really heart of Silicon Valley. And so I worked some years there. And obviously, when you live in Silicon Valley, at some point, you also want to start your own company, which I did.
Yep.
So I started a company in biotech software.
Right. What did you do in biotech?
There was biotech. There was kind of like a lab management software. So kind of like an early version of what today is known as Wikipedia. Right?
Yeah.
But just for biotech researchers. And so this company got acquired. So I basically went through this whole procedure of, founding a company, getting funded, selling the company, kind of like this whole experience that you would have as an entrepreneur. And so some years later, I was called by BMW in Munich. And they said, why don't you come work for us and help us set up a new type of innovation team? And I knew BMW from my time in Palo Alto, because they were clients of mine when I worked at IDEO, right? So then in 2012, I joined BMW. Initially, I said I created a team that created innovation strategies for BMW looking 10, 20 years into the future, the future of mobility, right? And while I was doing this, and this is now coupling back to my experience in Silicon Valley, I was wondering why BMW is not working with more startups.
Yeah.
So BMW was investing in a few startups per year, a handful, maybe like 3 or 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, we can benefit from startup technology in a much larger number and really across the entire company. So not just in a car or maybe for a new mobility service, but we can use it in manufacturing, logistics. We can use it for in marketing and cybersecurity and IT centers.
Yeah.
So we need a way of bringing in many, many more startups. And this is what got me thinking about what's a good, what you call corporate venturing model.
Okay.
So,
And this is early days before people actually even call it corporate venturing, when there was still just like venture capital inside of the firm, or okay.
Let's say back then, the word corporate venturing was synonymous with venture capital.
Okay.
Corporate venture capital, you just leave out the capital part and you call it corporate venturing. So, and that's what I did back in, I'm talking about 2013 somewhere. I approached the guys in corporate venture capital at BMW and said, just why don't you invest in more startups? 3 or 5, it's kind of like, walking into a huge supermarket full of candies. I'm a little child, but I can only pick like 2 or 3 things, and that's not enough. So they said, well, we need more money, correct? And I said, well, let's find more money, correct? That's an easy answer, correct? So the problem should be solvable. So I talked to some other guys in the headquarters and said, we want to invest in 50 startups per year, so we need more money. And the guy says, we can't invest in 50 startups per year because it's not about the money. It's about, I cannot handle 50, let's say,
mini M&As.
Well, it's even worse than that because you don't own the company, but you still
just
own
oversight.
you have to do the oversight, right? So you may bring in 50, that's 51 year, 50 now, that's 100, 150. Then some of them die away. But even if the technology is worthless for us, because it could happen, right? We would still be owning massive amounts of startup equity stakes, minority equity stakes, which just cause us fees and all sorts of headaches, right? I cannot just sell them off, right? So forget about it. So this was my insight where I thought, well, corporate venture capital is not really scalable. Now, the other thing I had an insight about was, and that comes from my time in Silicon Valley, is that the better the startup, the harder it becomes to invest.
Of course.
Correct. Your benchmark, you want to invest in OpenAI? Well, maybe not, right? Or your Sequoia, maybe not. So it's a highly competitive thing. So if you're corporate and you really want to work with the very best startups, but then maybe the startup is oversubscribed, like there's no room to invest. Maybe they don't even
and they
want.
don't even see you as strategic, right?
Exactly.
The conversation you're having on the maybe not is today the luxury of abundance here, just saying, yeah,
Exactly.
not really.
Exactly. So basically, I was facing a tool that had 2 design issues, right? One is not scalable.
Yep.
And the second is the better the startup, the less powerful my vehicle, which makes no sense, even for BMW. So I thought, we need to figure out something else, right? And so really, I was really, and at the time and still today, I mean, the big consultancies, the McKinseys, the BCGs, the big academics like Chesbro, they all go and say, corporate venture capital is your innovation tool. You just got to do it right. And I say, no matter how right you do it, it won't work in the way it needs to work, which is accessing a lot of startups and accessing the very best startups so that no startup says no. And even if I would hire Mr. Andreessen Horowitz himself or Mr. Mark Andreessen or Ben Horowitz, it wouldn't work, right? Because of those inherent design flaws. So here's where I thought, well, let's do something different. So it really came probably one day in the shower. I thought, well, the easiest thing is probably just to be a client. Just buy the goddamn product, right? Just go to the startup and buy it. And if the startup has a lot of money, then it will even be better for us because it will make this purchase more secure, right? So and then I talked to the guys from purchasing, and they said, well, we've been buying startup technology for ages. And we've been doing this, and this is nothing new to us. And I said, well, how many startups did you buy from?
Yeah.
And they said, I don't know, maybe one or two. And I said, oh, and tell me about those experiences. And then they were saying, well, it takes over 2 years to purchase from a startup. There's a lot of legal hassle around it. Then
all the things that startups and entrepreneurs like me listening to this podcast right now are going, oh, PST, 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 PST.
exactly.
Yeah.
So then, but here's where I thought, well, this is something I can fix.
Got it.
The other thing I
How?
cannot fix. Well, it's actually quite obvious. First of all, I said, we shouldn't be a client, we should be a venture client, right? So just like giving money to a startup, not everybody is a venture investor. You're just giving money to the startup, right?
Yeah.
But if you are a venture capital, you have a good model behind it. It just works differently, right? The difference. So I coined this term and said, well, we need to position ourselves as some of the early adopter venture client, but we also need a model for that. We cannot just use the processes and the tools that BMW has to purchase from other companies, right? I mean, BMW spends a year 60 billion per year in buying technology and stuff. They have 100,000 suppliers, so it's something you can scale.
Yeah.
But they were applying those tools for a Bosch, which is a supplier, the same as for a startup. And that was really let's say, the innovation in the business processes, where I said we need a venture client model. And so we need to change our decision systems. We need to change our contracting. We need our legal part. We need to make things like
your risk culture and appetite,
we,
perhaps.
well, we need to, and one of the important things, and because I always had the attitude of a startup exists because it can do something BMW cannot do, right? So, and the startup exists because the startup is addressing a big pain point, right?
Exactly.
So if the pain point is not big, then the startup will fail no matter what, correct? So in a way, the essence of the model, of a good model, venture client model, is to find those pain points. It's not so much let's change the engineer. It's more find the engineer who's really suffering from a big problem, like the engineer who's trying to find a technology to charge the battery in 3 minutes, right? So if I go to this guy and say, I found a startup that can charge a battery in 3 minutes to 1,000-mile range, the only reaction will be, I want to have it, right?
Of course.
But then I need to enable that transaction, that technology transfer. So
at scale.
And that's what I did at BMW. I really defined this whole set of processes and tools and specialized team. We also created a brand around venture clienting, the BMW Startup Garage. So, and we established a system of really tracking and finding the relevant problems within the company.
Okay.
So we really branded ourselves not so
on a way of helping them do an ROI on use cases, on really figuring out how to get ready to intake new technology. Okay.
So the first process step is...
You guys listened, right? Please. Okay.
So obviously the first process step that you need to do as a good venture client, and the important thing for startups is not every company that buys your product is a good venture client.
Correct.
They could be a terrible venture client, correct? They could come to you and say, I want exclusivity. They could come to you and say, you need to share your IP and basically, give it to me for free, and you must allow me to invest and all those things. And that's just a bad venture client. So a good venture client is really a company that has first of all, a defined, specialized team to do this. And that team works with a set of resources and processes that are specialized for that. So, so
that's like a startup sniffle test of what to look for when looking at this big, giant that normally VCs are asking you to go after as a startup. And saying, go after this big bank client. And the bank client usually will say something just like what you described. Give me the IP. Give me everything.
Exactly.
Give me exclusivity. Change your product to fit me just a little.
Exactly. Which is the recipe for getting the bad startups. And that's what I implemented at BMW. I said, forget about all those things, because that's a recipe for bad startups. And by the way, most startups are bad, right? Just statistically, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's 50 million new companies per year, and about 5 to 10,000 get funded. That's 0.1%, 0.1% or so. So
Yep.
it's most startups are really bad. Most startups are really desperate for money, so they would do everything. But the good startups won't.
Correct.
Right? You go to Sam Altman and say, change your product or give me your IP or do this or that, correct? And he probably says, well,
hi, here's a kite and it flies.
Exactly.
In a really nice way.
so it won't work. So
Yeah.
in a way, if you want to have a system that detects the best startups, you got to really approach them with something that they actually want to can talk to you and act to for. And at the end of the day, the startup and even the highly funded startups, the thing they value the most initially is something very simple, which is a purchase order. Right? They don't want yes, you're accepted to my accelerator. They don't care.
Yeah.
Yes, they see a term sheet from a CVC to some extent as a validation, kind of like the
helpful, certainly.
The helpful thing to maybe acquire, but at the end of the day,
maybe recruit, or maybe do some other sort of semi-tangible and tangent things for sure. Yeah.
So what you want as a startup from a corporate is a purchase order, and a supplier number. That's your green card into the corporate. It's not the term sheet from the CVC. And by the way, the CVC cannot give you a purchase order.
Correct.
They only can
Sometimes
give you
they can actually make it complicated.
Sorry?
Sometimes they can actually make it even more complicated depending on their reputation inside of a large organization. I've often
and that's a very
learned
good point.
that lesson.
That's a very good point, because that's many times overlooked. There's a compliance issue.
Yeah.
Because now you want to buy from the company that you partly own. And the other thing is you will most likely scare away other clients, right? So
in the exact same sector.
Exactly. BMW invests. So would Audi buy from that startup? Well, maybe not, right?
Yeah.
Because they are scared of maybe BMW being. So there is inherent also risks for that. But the main case really is that at the end of the day, a corporate benefits from a startup by using its technology, not by having equity on its bank account. And the startup grows at the end of the day by transferring its technology into a corporate setting, because that's where they're founded for, right?
Of course.
And
achieving scale.
Exactly. And that allows them to scale, that allows them to improve, because now they can use the customer feedback for improvement. But all that, is, has a certain amount of complexity, which is going to the guy who has just bought, I don't know, 50,000 doors for a car.
Okay.
Won't be the guy who's able to really decide between the good and the bad starter. They need a special team. So I established that after the model, I said, well, we also, part of the model needs to be really a dedicated team or organizational unit. So what I call a venture client unit. And that's, and I gave it a name, gave it a brand, so it can communicate, and especially communicate nicely to the inside, not the outside. Every startup knows BMW, but not every BMW guy knows what a startup is, right?
Of course.
So the BMW Startup Garage is I established this name and brand and team. So within BMW, people could start understanding the value of startups, and could see that this would be the team that would help them identify which problems are startup relevant and which not, would help them find the right startups, would make a thorough assessment, and above all, would then take away a lot of the work that the business units do not want to do in regards to, RFP, contract negotiation, the whole legals part, supplier numbers, and so on, correct? So basically,
all the organizational burden.
Exactly, which was lower.
Which, as you said, is 2 years in some companies. Like, we've all have horror stories out there.
Exactly. So what we did is we accomplished the following things. First of all, we reduced it to a few months from first contact to first contract. We increased the amount by startups by more than a factor of 10 per year. So significant boost in the number of startups. The quality of startups went up significantly, because no startup said no. You didn't even need the VC. You just called them up and said, look, I want to purchase your product. What do you think? Let's talk. And then we have a special team for that, so everything is easy for you. So that was very... so it really worked nicely, and most importantly, within BMW, the engineers were saying, wow, this is really helpful. because we know that startups are out there that have better technology than we. What we didn't have was a support
Okay.
to distinguish the problem that is good for a startup and the problem that's not good for a startup. For example, how do you distinguish that a problem is a startup can solve better than other suppliers or BMW with its 20,000 person R&D team, right?
Mhm.
You need to figure that out first, right?
Of course. And also with that comes back the risk criteria of like, is this something that regulatorily I need to own, buy, rent?
Exactly.
Where do I need supervision? And we're
Exactly.
talking about
Exactly.
not only BMW, the car, but everything else that people don't think for
Yeah,
the system, for security, for the technology that goes
exactly.
in to a brand that is well known
Yeah.
for customers.
So
So fast forward to now, what did you realize when you left and put this all in place? Is that it worked or that there was a better model?
well, venture
'Cause
clienting worked with a good model
okay.
at BMW. So at BMW, I did this for 3 years between 2015 and 18. And at BMW, then I noticed two things. First of all, I got at least one visit per week from another corporate asking me, what is this venture client model about?
Yeah.
How can you, what do you do to access the best startups, to reduce really the technology transfer times? So here I saw that what in a way was a problem for BMW, which is, how do I get in the best startup technology, was also a problem of other corporates. And I saw another thing, which was that the BMW Startup Garage, so the venture client unit, could benefit from help from an outside venture client solutions provider. So a
Okay.
company specialized in servicing venture client units. So in a way, think about it like this way, maybe, if every department, let's say a marketing department,
Mm-hmm.
has an advertising agency, right?
Of course.
They have a research agency.
Sure.
So why wouldn't the venture client department not have an outside support that would provide them with special data, special technology, and special consulting services, so that the internal venture client unit would be equipped with even better resources, instead of doing everything by itself? Because, for example, one piece is a software to manage this whole process of finding problems, looking at thousands of startups,
Yeah.
managing those
Scouting in
the
itself.
scouting, then the follow-on agreements, whether it's
Mhm.
a supply agreement, whether it's an M&A agreement, correct? This needs software, and so so I thought this software doesn't make sense that BMW writes its own software for venture clienting, or it probably
Okay.
needs to write software for its car, which is difficult enough. So here's where I saw a need for a company that would both help corporations to set up venture client units in a state-of-the-art
Consulting.
fashion,
Yeah.
providing them with consulting, but also technology and data. And I would
And a
also
framework that I think you've developed that we've been talking about.
exactly.
Mhm.
And we would also support the operations. So once the venture client unit is running, we would help them with finding startups, assessing startups. We would do internal trainings. We would do storytelling, branding of the
Mhm.
venture client unit, so that people among thousands
Can
of
help sell the idea internally, right? That's
exactly.
a huge job that people
Yeah,
overestimate.
and it's not as difficult as you think once you do it, because
Yeah.
once they understand what a startup is, everybody loves it. There's nobody saying, "Oh, leave me alone." So the not invented here syndrome doesn't really apply to the good startups. It applies to just about everything else, like like your colleague,
Bad
right?
interactions.
Yeah. So here's where I started. I thought we need a company for that, and that's how 27pilots was born in 2018. So our first client was BMW itself, that said,
Okay.
okay, well, support the BMW Startup Garage from the outside. We're still working with BMW today.
That's exciting. So you still work with BMW Garage.
Yes.
That's
We're still
incredible.
the main,
Cool.
let's say, backbone
Mm-hmm.
of the Startup Garage. The second client was Bosch.
Mm-hmm.
The third client was Holcim, the world's biggest cement company, Lafarge-Holcim back then called. And so and with those three clients, we could really validate, our product at 27pilots, which was at one part support an existing venture client unit
Mm-hmm.
and help that unit grow and do better work. And on the other hand, implement this model and also tailor it to the needs of a specific corporate that's in a different industry. And so with those three initial clients, we were quite successful financially, didn't need any investment.
Congratulations.
We were profitable from the very beginning, and we grew. So by today, we've worked with over 30 corporations, including like, Airbus, Siemens, Bosch. So big companies, but also interestingly very small companies that normally
Amazing.
don't do corporate venturing. Companies that are more in the, let's say, billion-dollar range as opposed to the $50 billion range. And for them, this concept also
I
works.
can only imagine how transformational that would have been, because just even the lack of frameworks or resources or time or equipped teams or skills, like we all know the companies on the $50 billion range have the McKinseys, have the BCGs, have the Deloittes, have a lot of those people on payroll.
Yeah.
Effectively, right? And that means support, other resources. It's just the impact of that. How has it been working with startups? So like, does 27pilots approach and work and scout and is continuously looking? Is there a particular space that you help problem solve in, or are you going in with the framework to say, here's how we work with any startup?
We never work directly with a startup.
Okay.
Because we're not the sales channel of a startup.
Of course.
We only take money from the corporate. We believe that a good venture client unit is like having a good kitchen.
Cool.
With the tools and the recipes. If you don't have that kitchen, the startups just remain ingredients or food on the outside, but they won't really get in. So we say, if you don't have a great kitchen with great recipes, you will not be able to benefit from that great ingredient for your food. It will just rotten outside your door. Or once you bring it in, you won't be able to do anything with it because you don't know what to do with it. So we really focus on building that inside the companies. And then our teams now work in those kitchens, and maybe sometimes they even are the main cooks. But we always approach a startup with the name of the corporate. So we don't want to go into the business of being the intermediary or the scout, or let's say the business development people. We would. So within those corporates, so my team, they are now in multiple corporates being part of those venture client unit teams, and we touch startups, thousands of them continuously in just about any area, whether it's some special material in construction, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's anything to do with ESG, whether it's really the hypothesis that
I
startup.
can only imagine IoT, mobility, and a lot of things with the clients like Bosch and BMW. They're innovating quite a tremendous bunch.
We have at this point somewhere around 40,000 startups evaluated in our database. So every startup we evaluate as part of a corporate.
Okay.
Right.
So it's part of the process of like my readiness.
Exactly. So let's say we go into, let's say, a company and they say, okay, we would like a venture client unit, correct? Imagine, I don't know.
HSBC, BBVA, put a bank that has that here, or a telco.
Exactly. And then what we do
is... Which also could use some innovation and has a lot of opportunity. We are a Mobile World Congress after all.
There's no lack for need of innovation. That's a good thing. So we go in.
Let's take one of these big giants that take forever to move. So that any startup can have PST from spending at least 18 months to get anything done.
Exactly. So what we do is we go in and we say, well, first of all, let's figure out where are your big pain points in technology, right? What are the big areas in technology that on which your future depends, right? Is it your product? Is it your service? Is it your call center? What are those areas? And then let's figure out, what's the startup supply? How much venture capital is flowing into that area? And you can use that really as an external budget to foster your technology in those areas.
So is it like a metric of saying, hey, hello, there might be lots of solutions, lots of options out there, and here's where the money is flowing.
Exactly.
Okay.
If your problem is, I don't know, to use, to do anything around.
Give us a good one. Give us a good one that you're excited to talk about here at Mobile World Congress. A problem that one of the clients, without naming names, is tackling.
Is
put him on the spot.
There's so many.
Anything to do with AI?
Well,
or
startups
anything
have
to do
been,
with authentication and IoT?
the AI part has been part of startups since ever, right?
I know it's database. I know.
So it's,
I do these interviews. My
yeah,
background's math and econ, so yeah,
yeah.
I hear
So
you.
it's more
I've been
about,
saying nothing is sexy
okay,
before it was.
let's think about one easy thing we had with an insurance company. So an
Cool.
insurance
Let's
company,
go again.
an insurance company spends a lot of money on repairing cars that get destroyed by what's happening in nature.
Yeah, and it's
Correct?
going to unfortunately happen more and more.
Exactly.
hmm And it's not only
Okay.
cars that are going to have that effect,
Exactly.
but we all know I work in
Okay.
UNESCO as
Okay.
well. So,
So the thing is, you think about a huge insurance company that
hmm
recognizes that yes, we need technology in order to predict things in nature that would harm our clients. If we can find such a technology, this would obviously help us, help our clients. It would help us save with premium payments and so on, right? So and now the thing is, okay, so how many startups could help us with that? How much money is flowing into some kind of technology that helps us predict, um,
capture,
see whether,
understand data,
exactly,
which data is out
exactly,
there,
exactly,
who owns
yeah.
it. Yeah.
And this is, you can imagine, this is a lot of stuff. It's not
hmm
just, okay, there's going to be a snowstorm, so park your car
That's the
somewhere else.
easy part.
Because you also need technologies then to basically, generate, whatever kind of alerts you need all kinds of, so that could be, hundreds, thousands of startups just working on that piece. So the first question is, how much venture capital do we have available for that specific problem area?
hmm
And that's one of the important tasks of a venture client unit, to kind of take that
Assess.
and
hmm
assess, okay, is startup really a resource? Because maybe Microsoft is all you need, right? And
hmm
maybe you don't have to go beyond that. And then you should, right?
Yeah.
So you should only work with
Or
startup.
maybe this is an area for your R&D team to go partner with Microsoft or use some other patent out
Exactly.
there or figure it out that this is something they could be uniquely positioned to do
Exactly. Or
before it
even,
becomes an innovation theater, which we've all been to those too, right?
yeah. And that's what we don't want to do. But the other important thing in venture clients, and that's really a message to the dear venture capitalists here, is what if many corporates who have a good venture client framework system, they're collecting problems all the time where they say, this is nothing we can do by ourselves.
hmm
They look if startups are out there with competitive advantages and enough capital. But what if there is no startups with that capital? Why shouldn't you call the VCs and say, look, guys, we have those issues. Why didn't you start investing into those types of entrepreneurs? Because to my knowledge, the VCs are just as blind as many others in knowing what the corporate needs, right?
They
So,
might not really, really definitely not here openly admitted in the camera that they're blind. But I think that this is like also the data knowledge that we see when, proper governments function and look at this as supplies of
yeah,
education demand.
yeah,
And this is no different. We're
yeah,
talking about energy resources and we're talking about this being leading or lagging indicators to
yeah,
say, okay, my readiness is here.
yeah.
So how are you guys using this data and intelligence or helping? Because, we've all seen these innovation theaters, we all seen these, and we've seen these, annual, I can't count, and I
Yeah,
will not name names.
yeah,
In the 40 financial institutions I've worked with, the names of heads of innovation were incredible people that tried to gather a lot of these use cases across the years and across the quarters, and they get deprioritized
hmm,
or they change. The next year 5-year plan has this new name,
yeah.
and now everything that we did is going to change, and all this data and this richness of technology readiness or startup readiness to solve my problem goes away. How do you index this beyond, Gemini and generative AI and being a consulting firm? How do you help a venture capital team to do?
You mean now the venture capital team? You mean the teams on the corporate side who do
I mean, the
innovation
teams on
theater?
the how do they map this? How do they not keep track of this collective intelligence that exists in these many use cases without an ROI or without the readiness of the technology or with the right
Yeah.
prompt and articulation?
Well, as of today, very few companies really have good kitchens. I must say.
That's what I'm trying to, I guess, get
So,
to. Okay.
so what we see now in the history when we look at the multiple corporates that we've worked at, which is obviously just a fraction. I mean, there are
Right.
some around 10,000 companies worldwide with more than $1 billion revenue, right? That's 10,000. Out of those, I think some around 400, 600 run corporate venture capital units. The average lifespan of a corporate venture capital unit is somewhere around 3.8 years, and then they close down.
Well,
Now,
where does this budget go? Where do these people go to failed dreamland
well,
of these innovation theaters I talk about?
well, they
kind of look like cemeteries now.
well, they basically go with some kind of a, let's say, recommendation or thinking that, investment is an innovation tool, and then just to find out that it's not an innovation tool, it's just a barrier to innovation most of the time. And then at some point, the CFO and the CEO goes there and say, well, show me the strategic benefit. There is none. And then they just say, well, let's just close down the fund, right? Because I'd rather put
This
my
is not
money.
for us.
Yeah.
We don't invest in innovation, not directly.
Well, because it doesn't solve the problem, correct? How many more cars do you sell by owning 2% of OpenAI? Nothing. Zero. How many more cars do you sell if the software of OpenAI helps your battery charge faster? Many more, right? So ownership of equity is not a necessary condition to gain
success and to
success.
gain access to
It's
this.
actually more of a problem because now it's very expensive unless, obviously, and we need to always emphasize that, unless you get some strategic rights with the investment, which is some kind of mini M&A transaction, right? Where you say, okay, now I buy 5% of your company and I have a first right of refusal, but you give me exclusivity. But you do this in a later stage, really after you've done some solid, let's say, venture client work with that startup. So what we're seeing is that accelerators are closing down because it costs a lot of money, no output. CVCs are closing down, most of them, a lot of money, no output. Strategic output, right?
Okay.
Really more sales, more profitability because of startup technology. The venture client units that we have set up since 2018, zero closers, nothing. Not during COVID, not during Putin, no crisis, and probably not because of Trump, correct? They all are running and they're all successful, similar metrics as we had at BMW. An X10 of the amount of startups, strong increase of efficiency in transferring startup technologies. Now, I don't know all and now what we really need to do in a corporate setting is to get the executive attention towards, guys, you need to set up a solid system of venture clienting, correct? It sounds easy, but it's like soccer, right? The rules are easy, but playing the Champions League, it costs money, right?
It's like telling us in communication, it's just like a little video, right? Just a little video.
Exactly.
Just do a little video.
Exactly. It's
like everybody can do a little video.
Exactly.
And the underestimation of the craft
Exactly.
and the framework and the discipline that is required to take some of this stuff seriously.
Exactly.
And actually to be able to, I think you talked about transfer. I'm mindful of our time, but I want to wrap with asking you, what are some of the exciting companies and trends that you have seen beyond your successful no closure,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Happening in the VC space? Because that sounds like a doomsday story. Everybody's closing their doors. So if they're not talking to you, they're out there closing their doors. They're out there saying that maybe this isn't for us. But we know there's one fundamental truth. Nobody can build everything alone. And with the speed of technology change, whether you're servicing machines or people, the demands are just getting higher.
Yes.
So having this notion that even to sell cars, you're going to have all the parts of that experience are a little outdated. So how do these companies that are out there have put, their political neck out there, have told the board, have had a failure before? What do they do other than call you?
Okay.
They can. We'll leave it on the show notes. But
I would think if you would ask all the Fortune 500 CEOs, have you ever considered setting up a venture client unit with a specific framework, model, as a new way of doing corporate venturing? They would say, I've never heard of that.
Yes.
That is,
Which is why
yeah.
we got you in this interview, to try to understand if there's a new model,
Okay.
a new way.
So we think, given that it's now BMW, it's an Airbus, it's Bosch, it's Siemens, we are seeing that the notion and, let's say, the awareness of this new tool is rising. It's becoming a topic. It's also becoming a topic at the big business schools, INSEAD Business School, IESE Business School, ETH in Zurich, many German business schools. It still haven't, well, there's a Harvard Business Review article about it, but it's not still in the Harvard
Yet to
Business School
come.
classroom, but it will come. And I think this will be really a disruptive force in corporate venturing, because it will basically change the mindset from the startups need our help to we need the help of startups. And to do this right, we need to change some things internally. And those things all have to do with technology adoption. It's
Okay.
not about capital investments. The capital investment is important when it's a controlling stake, because
Yeah.
at some point you want to be the exclusive client, right? Some points you want to buy the startup because you want.
You would understand that that's part of your moat or whatever it is, but that is such an exercise of awareness and an exercise also of longevity of planning, which a lot of corporates do not have the luxury or the culture. Is my 3-year plan, my 5-year plan? When you're thinking in 3 to 5 year plans and you're negotiating with 3 to 5 year to 7-year VC cycles,
Yeah.
this math is bound to be unaligned.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't agree more. I have watched through many, many projects across the world, the amount of money wasted. And this dream that we all know that technology will transform the planet and we can't do it alone. But the collaboration piece is just still stuck.
Yeah. And one of the reasons is they think about it as a collaboration, and it's not.
They don't think about it as business. An ROI?
Well, I think they always say we need to collaborate with startups. I say no, it's the wrong wording. We need to benefit from startups. Now, I can punch in a credit card number and use that technology. There's no need to collaborate, right?
Yeah.
Why should I set up a team if that's enough, right? I just
Correct.
So the word collaboration is just too generic. And it's really, if the thinking is, okay, we need to set up something that allows us to obtain, really let's, academically speaking, to optimize the resource startup for my company, optimizing and seeing the startup as a resource that fills a technology gap, whether through exclusivity, because you acquire the startup, or whether it's through some kind of contract, because now it becomes a supplier, doesn't mean, but it's a resource. And we need to find all those gaps that we have in our technology, let's say, landscape in the companies, and see which of those gaps, and there are many, can best be filled with startups, because there's a lot of venture capital. And those gaps that cannot be filled best with startups, that's when I should call Ben Horowitz and say, you guy got to invest. And this guy will thank me because now he suddenly knows something he didn't know before. And by the way, he doesn't know. I've spoken with multiple VCs in Silicon Valley, and they have no interaction whatsoever except going to dinner with some big time CEOs. And the problems
Or just as lost about their ROIs and their use cases.
Yeah, because the use cases are driven by middle management, not by top management. So that's a big mistake of VC, right? Many VCs, well, I think the good VCs know that at the end of the day, the decision to purchase from a startup is a manager, it's not the CEO. The decision to acquire a startup comes from a manager, not the CEO, because it's the manager who needs to justify that the startup is doing something better, faster, and that spending 5 million or 50 million or 500 million is just in total, a benefit.
Of the benefit. Yeah.
So if the VCs would interact more with venture clients, instead of trying to harness fund and funds, right? Basically, how many VCs go to a corporate and say, oh, why don't you invest in my fund? I will give you access to my deal flow. And I say, well, that's an expensive deal flow. Of course, I mean, you can just pay $2,000 a month to PitchBook and you have the deal flow of 10,000 VCs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how cheap can it get, right? So many VCs still go to the corporate because they want to be and get money to the funds, and by that have a higher management fee, right? And then they are just repeating the good old story of this is a great innovation tool. You just need to do it right and get rid of your not invented here syndrome. I say, no, what you need to do is you need to get the change your mindset to being a venture client, set up a good team around venture clienting, not about venture investing. And by that, you really prepare the culture, you prepare the processes for really absorbing startup technology wherever it's needed and not where it's not needed. Because when you bring startups in where it's not needed, then it's bad for everybody, right? It's bad for the VCs. Bless you.
Sorry. It's bad for, continue your sentence.
Yeah, it's bad for every stakeholder, right? So a good startup needs to survive and needs to be identified, but the bad startup they need to die away fast, right? Because that's just the way it needs to work, right?
The way the world should work.
Exactly. Not everybody has to, and I think once we get to this knowledge that at the end of the day, the role of corporates and corporate venture in the world of startups is that of the smart, the fast, the good client rather than the co-investor. Once we get that mindset into the business schools and into the heads of the CEOs, I think this will generate a huge boost to the world of startups. There will be more venture capital. It will be easier to filter out the good ones from the bad ones. Technology will arrive faster where it's actually needed, and I think that's really all it takes. And then let's talk again in 10, 20 years, see what has happened.
I'm holding you accountable to the next Mobile World Congress and the next time we do something, and probably Germany. I'm quite involved in some FinTech Germany awards and some startup awards in that space.
Yeah.
We'll come back to conversation and have BMW and Bosch tell the stories behind this change. Thank you so much for sharing with me and for having had the audacity to start a company to say that the model should change. I think that's what's required. The audacity to say that there's still goodness in, the coexistence of difference. And I think you said something to me that really struck me. Banks as an example, they've really understood the benefit of buying IBM. So they've understood the concept about when do I use risk to put in a bigger company, the automation or the cloud management or the security. How do you put the risk? I often say this about fraud. Fraud as an example in the corporate space is a great area of innovation.
Yeah.
And one that the speed of startups failing could actually be in your favor because, criminals in other places don't really care about protocols and corporate governance and using the latest and greatest. So I think it's this adjustment of the awareness of where are you in your journey and what kind of do you need changes this world from a zero-sum game that we've learned in VC, which we all know that hasn't really worked. So thanks so much for sharing.
Well, thank you.
Enjoy Mobile World Congress.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you next time. We'll leave the show notes. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.